Adrien is the Director of Market Evolution for the PJM Interconnection, and she serves as the lead within the Market Services Division for coordinating development of the division's strategic plan. And she's responsible for the oversight of PJM's demand response program, emerging markets, renewable services, and market analysis. She's previously been at the Structure Group and the Mirant organization.
Right, it's a horrible name.
And Adrien has an undergraduate degree from Georgia Tech in mechanical engineering, and I'm really grateful that she's here to join us.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here with you all. So I think we started at the wholesale level, went down to distribution, and now I'll come back up and make a little sandwich out of it. I wanted to share, I didn't know the audience level of knowledge with PJM. And what I've found in the past is even people who've had repeated exposure to PJM have a varying level of knowledge about PJM. Even people within PJM have a varying level of knowledge within PJM because it's, there's a lot going on there. But I thought at a high level I'd try to cover a little bit about what we are, where we are, what we do, and then really spend more time talking about demand response. I thought that would be of particular interest. That said, during the question and answer, I'm happy to go wherever the topics lead us. So here you have our statistics. I think I'm obligated to start with this slide, but I find it helpful at least in terms of the map. So the United States is essentially divided into 3 interconnects that are predominantly disconnected other than by DC. One's east of the Rockies, one's west of the Rockies, and then there's Texas. So we're part of the Eastern Interconnect. We go from New Jersey, apparently reluctantly, over to over to Chicago and down to Tennessee, North Carolina area. So 13 states, all are part of them, plus DC. We do have over 900 member companies. It started with 3. And we've grown tremendously even in just recent years, and a lot of our participants are now smaller companies, maybe with new technologies, innovating, load-serving entities, and when it comes to demand response, they could be curtailment service providers, which is our fancy name essentially for aggregators that add value to their customer. Some key stats that may or may not mean anything to you in terms of their unit of measure, but I'd urge you to try to remember them because they might then give you an understanding of the percentage impact of demand response within PJM's resource mix. So our peak demand is about 165 gigawatts, or 165,000 megawatts if you don't like the conversion. And we have a little over 180,000 megawatts of generating capacity. So those numbers will become important when we take a look at how much is demand response. So 165 is the peak demand that I'd ask you to try to remember. There we go. There's 3 priorities that we really have. And I guess being engineers, we thought it would look cool if there were gears involved. But anyway, the first is keeping the lights on, or reliability. And that's really when you talk about our 24/7 operations in 2 dual live sites that make sure the supply and demand balance are always equal so that we can keep the frequency at 60 hertz and not experience blackout. So that's really what reliability comes down to. There's a lot of ancillary services that go along with that. And in order to do that, we have markets, which is sort of another priority, fair and efficient markets, that really overlay the system operations and provide support to the reliability that we're there to ensure. And then the third gear is really system planning. So we look out 15 years, given the current resource mix, given the forecasted load, given the forecasted generation that's in our queue, where are the constraints going to be, and do we need new transmission lines? And if so, then our board will consider the studies and order them to be built, and that's really where it comes down to the planning. So those are the 3 primary priorities that we have, is really the reliability or operations, the markets, and then the planning. So what we don't do, and this is where I think a lot of people, even who have an understanding of PJM, get a little confused. We really don't own anything. I'm not even sure if we own the buildings where I work. We probably own some computers and some servers and things like that. Some of those are probably even leased. But we don't own any generation. We don't own the transmission lines. So that's what our members own. We're there to help coordinate, but we don't actually own them. We're not responsible for the maintenance of the transmission lines. We're not responsible for the maintenance of the generators. We do help coordinate it. So the generators will check in with us, hey, is this a good time for me to do maintenance? And we approve the schedule, but we're not responsible for conducting the maintenance. We don't have any trucks out there working on power lines, although the guys that are out at the lines will check in with ops and say, hey, can I do that now? And so we really provide the coordination, but not actually conducting the work itself. And then finally, we don't serve retail customers. There are a few very large industries that connect directly to the wholesale system, but by and large, we don't serve customers directly. There's someone in between that's a load serving entity to deal directly with the retail customer. So if we don't deal with the retail customer, then some would wonder, how is it that you have demand response? And I would argue a fairly successful demand response program to date, albeit we do have room for growth in that area. And the way we do that is our members interact with the end-use customer and then bring us the demand response in the form of megawatts. We just look at it for megawatts. They handle the contracting with the customers. They handle the notification to the customers. They're the kind of middleman, and those are called curtailment service providers. Now we have different entities that interact with end-use customers as well. We have load-serving entities, or LSCs, tons of acronyms. So an LSC is an entity that actually serves energy to an end-use customer. May or may not own any wires. Maybe a new upstart with a computer who's buying on the open market and selling, maybe has a generation portfolio, maybe doesn't, maybe has a long-term contract, maybe doesn't, but they're serving the energy portion of a customer's bill. Then we have EDCs, so those are your traditional incumbents. PECO in this area, right, would be an EDC. They own the wires. If you have a blackout in your neighborhood, it's that entity that's coming out to put the wires back up, or one of their subcontractors, like in the case of the February ice storm. For me, it was Riggs, came up from DC and took care of me. I was really happy to see them when they came in. But those are the EDCs. They can also be load-serving entities, but they can just be a wires company. And then the curtailment service provider, which may or may not be an LSC, and may or may not be an EDC, but they can be all of those things. So there's lots of different roles that our end-use customer in our territory might see, but we just see, when it comes to demand response, the curtailment service provider. So they aggregate things to a wholesale level for us and bring us the megawatts. So now we'll think about how big this is in PJM's resource mix. So if you remember that 165 number, for this year, and our years don't run January through December, our years run June through May, and that just has to do with how we plan for the system, because we're historically a summer peaking utility, so we always want to get as close to the summer for our forecasts, so we start in June, and our delivery years run June through May. For this delivery year, we have about 10 gigawatts of demand response. So I would suggest that's a large portion of what's going to be needed to serve the 165 gigawatt peak load. Now that 10 gigawatts is demand response that participates in our capacity market. We have several different markets to meet the needs in our footprint. One of them is a capacity market. It's a 3-year forward look at what resources will be needed and demand response can participate in that market just like a generation resource can. We also have energy efficiency. That's more like 700 megawatts, so not quite a whole gigawatt. That's that little bubble there off on its own. It doesn't really respond directly to anything. So demand response is a response to a trigger, be it a price trigger or an administrative action by the system operator. Energy efficiency is some sort of reduction that's always there. Maybe replacing a process or heavy equipment or something like that. We also have economic demand response. So that is demand response that's participating in our day-ahead energy market. So we have a market, you bid in by noon, 4 o'clock, you find out your award, and then tomorrow you have to show up. You don't show up, there'll be financial consequences. We have about 3 gigawatts that are registered to participate in that market. Not that much participates every day. On average, we probably have about 50 megawatts that participates, but that's still sizable. It doesn't look sizable in PJM because PJM is so large, but 1 megawatt is a lot of load. So we have 50 megawatts participating pretty regularly in our energy market. If they make a commitment in our day-ahead market and they say we'll reduce in X hours at Y price, then when tomorrow comes, and if they were picked up, they have to go down to that level. You can be in the economic energy market and the capacity market, so you can participate in both. We also have a sink reserve market. For those of you in the industry, you might know that as spinning reserves. We changed it to sink reserves because spinning reserves indicates it's coming from a generator. But because of demand resources participating, we changed the nomenclature to sink reserve, meaning that you're synchronized to the grid. And we have demand response participating in that market. And what they need to do is if they're sent a signal, then they have to, if you're a generator, pick up. If your demand response, reduce within 10 minutes of when you receive that signal. In that market, we have 320 megawatts, but about 65 participates on a regular basis. And then finally, regulation. And this is a really interesting one to me. So our regulation market is a signal that gets sent every 4 seconds, and it's an automatic response. Usually it's AGC on a generator to automatically respond to small fluctuations in load. But we have demand response participating in that. We had a battery, I'm going to say 6 years ago. It's been a while now, 5, 6 years ago, that came and wanted to participate in the regulation market. And it didn't look like their performance was very good at all. Well, we later found out their performance was outstanding. It's just they were responding so quickly, we were having trouble measuring it and adjusting the signal. We were used to these big generators having to respond to the signal every 4 seconds, and the battery was responding instantaneously. We also learned that the battery was having difficulty responding because apparently our signal had an upward bias. So we then needed to create an additional, well, we didn't have to, but we wanted to because we encourage innovation. So we created a second regulation signal. We call it the dynamic regulation signal, or Reg-D, and that has a 0 bias. And the reason that was important for a resource like a battery is if we have an upward bias, they're going to get completely discharged and then can't participate any longer. So we had to create a signal that would bias around 0 such that they could charge and discharge and still provide the response. So we have about 3 megawatts that typically participates in our regulation market. So we have demand response not just in our capacity market, but in all of our major markets at PJM. And when you hear, I heard yesterday a response regarding our demand response that some end users might think they're getting paid to do nothing, that all they have to do is test. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. You do have to respond. There are years where we won't have any events. And if it's a year where we don't have any events, then you do have to test to prove that you could have responded if we needed you. Because the capacity product is really more like a call option. And so if we don't have a need to exercise that call in a year, we still want you to prove that you could have if we'd called on you. So that's a little bit about the participation in the market. And I wanted to show you what that looks like. So I apologize for the ugliness of this blue graph, but it comes from one of our data systems called eData. If you ever want to look at what the load in at PJM is at any time, you can go to our website, go to our tools, and look at eData. I can show you if you're really interested. And you can log in as a guest, and at any time see all sorts of information about our prices, about our forecasted load, about where our load's actually coming in. And this is just a screen scrape from one of those from a day in 2012 when we had the need to call on the capacity resources that have been procured through our forward market. We needed to call on not just our generation capacity, but our demand response. During the box there is the actual compliance window when we called on demand response and said, we need you down. We were approaching a peak. We were running shorter on resources. We needed to call on the demand response resources, which, unlike generation, which just turns on to meet the load, demand response shows a reduction in the load. So then you need fewer resources to meet it. And I think it's pretty visible what happens. We call either an hour or 2 hours in advance, starting next year, 30 minutes. And we say, hey, it's time for you to reduce. And you can see the blue line, which is the actual line, start to come down. And then when you get to that compliance window, the box, you can see that they maintained the reduction. And by that, the orange line that's there is what we probably think we would have experienced if we hadn't called on the demand response. So the difference between the blue line and that orange line is generation we didn't need because we had the demand response that could reduce. Another interesting thing that you see at the end, and this becomes very important for us in managing the grid, is that when you release it, the blue line doesn't keep going down. It typically, the blue line either flattens out or sometimes even bounces back because of the different mechanisms that our demand response providers used to reduce. They start turning it all back on. And so if we call on a lot of demand response, it's very important for us in grid ops to feather out the reduction so that we don't have a giant spring back at the end of an event. But this is real. So this isn't just getting paid to do nothing or just getting paid to test. When we need it, we call on it. It's there, and it's really a valuable part of our resource mix and relied on by grid operations. So who is it that provides this? I get asked this question all the time, and given that this is one focus on industry, I thought you'd find it particularly interesting that if you look at it, about half of it, well, it's hard to read because it's dark there, but the big chunk on the left side of the screen, that's from industrial and manufacturing. So really a large portion of our demand response comes from industry. We have another mix. We've got about 15% from residential. That's the other big one. About 10% from office buildings, and then a smattering of other providers. Then we ask them, how is it that you reduce? So what methods are you employing to create this reduction? And 37% say manufacturing. Now that can be different things depending on the ultimate end use, but a lot of times it's shutdown of a manufacturing process, shift of a manufacturing process, altering of a manufacturing process. We have a large portion, nearly a quarter, is from some sort of backup generation. So maybe they have some sort of on-site generation that they can turn on and really experience no difference in their consumption at their site. It's just where they consume from. And then a large portion, the dark red portion, is HVAC. So historically, this has been a summer product. Historically, as Ben mentioned, this has been a limited summer, June through September product. We won't call you for more than 6 hours at a time. We won't call you for more than 10 times. That's your compliance obligation. That is our call option on our demand response providers. We can call you more than that, but you only have to comply during these specified windows for these specified times. We can call you in November if we need you. It's just if you don't comply, you don't owe us any money. If you don't comply in July in the afternoon when we call you, you owe us about half your money if you have one response that doesn't come off for you. But so HVAC has been a large portion of it. This year, we now have 2 new products. It just started this June, that we now have an extended summer product, which goes from May through October. So instead of 4 months of the year, it's 6 months of the year. And then we also have an annual product, which is year-round. And on those, we have unlimited calls. So what's this worth to you, right? Last year, now these are in calendar year numbers because that's how our accounting's done, but last year was $500 million that was paid out to our demand response resources. You can see the different colors breaking down what it's paid for. The biggest payment is for that capacity market. We're paying them to be there in case we need them. As I mentioned, we did need them last year 5 times during the summer. But we also had several winter calls this year. As I indicated, that's voluntary response. But if you're available and can do it, we will pay you for the energy you reduced. It's just that if you don't respond or aren't available to respond, there's not a penalty if it wasn't the product you'd signed up for. So here's a look at our winter. This January was pretty challenging from a grid ops perspective. January 7th and 8th was the polar vortex dipping down from the Arctic, and we ended up with 22% of our generators on forced outage. It's pretty hard to meet your peak when nearly a quarter of your generators aren't there. We needed demand response. We asked them to give us situational awareness in the morning. If we were to call on you, how much is there? So again, there's not a compliance window, and that green bar is showing you expected. That's them reporting every day how much DR is available if we need it. And we do that every day of the year. We needed it then, and they showed up. They had their estimates pretty right. 100% on the first call, and then in the evening call, so 2 calls in one day on January 7th, about 3/4 showed up. Later in the month, around about Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and then the week following, we had a period of long, sustained cold, which was again challenging. And we had that memory of earlier in the month when we had 22% forced outage. So we called them again. There was a little less available at that point in time, but again, they showed up and were a valuable resource for us. So in addition to the 5 compliance calls we had in the last year, we also had several voluntary response calls in January that were very useful. So that's really demand response in the PJM market. This summer, we haven't had any events. This year, we almost became winter peaking. We were only a couple thousand megawatts above our winter peak in the summer because we've just had such mild weather and the load is so weather dependent. But on the years when we need it, it's really an invaluable resource. So that's all I had.